Thank you for the opportunity to kōrero. Absolutely huge topic of crucifixion and resurrection, if you like. Crucifixion leading to potential, the early seeds of resurrection. By no means into a fully restorative justice mode yet, but we're moving there. My first encounter with the story was actually in a publication written by the National Council of Churches of those days, nearly 30 years ago, called What Happened at Rangiaowhia. And I read it, and it's quite a good, still current analysis of the thinking of Governor Gray particularly, but also the involvement of General Cameron and others in their decision to attack Rangiaowhia and in their invasion of the Waikato, and the kind of veg and fruit market rationale behind that. They were, in the article, a very small group of fruit and veg merchants in Auckland became increasingly annoyed with the success of Ngāti Apakura, Ngāti Hinetū, in supplying fruit and veg to Auckland. And they were trading well, as you know, in the Māori world of those days. There were ships, there were flour mills, there were entrepreneurial trade discussions with Sydney, was beginning with California, the missionary activity which supplied ploughs, peach, pear, seeds and orchards, as well as certain kinds of agricultural iron implements, meant that a tribe like Ngāti Apakura, Ngāti Hinetū, with their own labour, their own vision, their own leadership, rangatiratanga, mana motuhake of those days, were able to thrive and were becoming a serious player in the emerging fruit and veg world. And it was that in particular that a very small group of Auckland business people became motivated to not only treat, parley, negotiate trade, but then later to invade on trumped up charges of an attack on Auckland, which was not being organised in a coherent or a big way by anybody. There were one or two verbal throwaway lines, but the Māori king actually wanted to protect Auckland and keep the lines of communication, tātou, if you like, open. Even when the invasion past the Mangatawhiti stream down through Rangiriri and so on, came to Ngāti Rewi Manga Maniapoto, the great Ngāti Maniapoto chief, who, of course, was looking after the Waipa area, including Rangiaowhia, but also Aotearangi, Te Awamutu, and so on. He even then tried to parley and tried to come to some kind of arrangement, a win-win arrangement, and that was ignored. And so we had the beginnings of invasive, predatory, colonial military incursion, which your listeners will know what happened at Rangiaowhia, particularly one of history's worst moral incursions into the mana and the, I suppose you'd say, the rangatiratanga of Ngāti Apakura and their own peaceful agricultural, horticultural mission base. It was designed to take that out, of course, because that would mean that stopped feeding those who were defending their land at Pātarangi and other places. I got all of this from the article, and it stayed in my conscience and my mind for a long time. And when I came across Ngāti Apakura, Ngāti Hinetū people, particularly Tom Roa, Bill Harris, and others at Rangiaowhia when I was Bishop of Waikato, it immediately turned on all those light bulbs, and I realised I was in the presence of the direct descendants of those who survived a war crime, who survived the invasion, the burning, and I was hearing their mamae, their ongoing sense of dispossession, and the consequences of total land loss following the attack on Rangiaowhia on February 21, 1864. Everything was lost, and they had to seek self-refuge, marae, papakainga, displaced options in other places with other iwi. And this came home to me personally, face to face, and so I became highly motivated from a justice peace perspective, reconciliation with justice, which was their agenda as well. And that's what has led to the current negotiation.
Kia ora. So Philip Richardson, I've been a bishop in this diocese since 1999, and in the early years I was largely based in Taranaki, and David and I were working closely together. We were the two bishops in the diocese, David based in Kirikiriroa in Hamilton, and myself in Taranaki largely. And then in about 2013, David took on the role as the Anglican Communion's ambassador to the Vatican, to the Holy See, and was in Rome for a few years. And I had oversight of the whole diocese, and then a few years in partnership with Bishop Helen Ann Hartley. And then since 2018, I've been the Bishop of both Waikato and Taranaki. So my association with Rangiaowhia began largely through the relationships that Bishop David had well established through his time as the Bishop of Waikato. Learning about that story for the first time was a bit like parihaka. I remember living for a time in South India and visiting a group of Jesuit priests who were working in a village just outside of Bangalore. And that was the first time that I'd heard about parihaka from them, because they had heard about it through Mahatma Gandhi, talking about this example of passive resistance. And it was, they sort of said to me, they didn't say, oh, you're from the land of the All Blacks. They said, oh, you're from the land of Te Rongamai and Tohokaki. And I went, okay, I guess I am. And that's when I started to read things like Dick Scott's Ask That Mountain, and Paul Reeves, who was a mentor for both Bishop David and I, of course, direct descendant of Te Rongamai, and his wife Beverly is a direct descendant of Paris, who was the land agent who facilitated the confiscation of Taranaki land. And so, in that family, you've got, both sides of that story. And then, of course, to discover that at Rangiaowhia, we had one of the most significant, if not the largest, massacre of women, children, and elderly here in the Waikato, and that they had a very strong connection with both the Anglican Church and the Roman Catholic Church, that whole community. Through David's telling me of that story and the people that I started to meet as a result, probably, I guess now 15, 20 years ago, that was my first encounter with that. A bit of our history in relation to that. I found myself on the day of the Christchurch massacres. I was sitting here in this office in Hamilton when the news came through, and I just felt really compelled to go to Rangiaowhia and to sit in the church there as that unfolded. Really, really important part of our history that we need to give greater voice to. This journey has been about understanding our own history and understanding our complicity in that history for our own people. Part of what I've experienced and seen over the last 20 years in this diocese has been an increasing number of our own parishioners from right across the diocese, Taranaki, Waikato, going on pilgrimages, trying to understand the history of places and people within the boundaries of our diocese and beyond, and recognising that our diocese represents the land in Aotearoa that was most compromised through the consequence of war and the exclusion of Māori from land and therefore from economic strength and full participation as the treaty anticipated. And so it's been a kind of journey of conversion of heart and mind for our people, and recognising that you can't be Anglican in the Diocese of Waikato and Taranaki without being active around restorative action. Reconciliation can only come through an honest understanding and telling of the history. That means you've got to listen to and learn from some uncomfortable elements and realities. And I certainly want to keep sort of pointing back to the influence of Paul Reeves and his absolute conviction that education has the power to transform society. The kind of Paulo Freire concept of the narratives of the oppressed setting free everyone to sort of full dignity and agency in building the future of society. And that journey's been a long, gentle, slow one, based, as I said, primarily in discovering our own history.
I think the early stages in relationship between Pākehā settlers and Māori mana whenua in the Waipai area, particularly Te Awamutu or Tauwhao, it was originally called Rangiaowhia, sometimes later called Hauriri, all of that area, they were quite good because, as you say, a tātou, you bring your kete, I'll bring my kete. Let's try and survive and thrive together as the world changes and as the Northern Hemisphere is starting to percolate down to the South Pacific and to Aotearoa in particular. We've got to work something out. We can't ignore the fact that increased population, settlement, entrepreneurial endeavour will mean pressure and increased numbers from the Northern Hemisphere. So the response of Rewi Manga Maniapoto, Potato, Te Whero, Tawhio, and so on, initially was a gracious quest for partnership, participation, protection, options, equity, rangatiratanga. Where have we heard those words before? Long before 1840, they were extended to the settler and the church community. They wanted a mutual win-win benefit. I suppose in the Waipai area, which is where Te Aumutu Rangiaowhia is based, some may dispute this, but at least 10 to 15 years of a mutual attempt at cross-pollination and thriving with each other's skills. Māori were in the majority, Pākehā were a minority, and the early Pākehā, particularly Benjamin and Harriet Ashwell, were very respectful of the mana of local rangatira, ariki, and so on. They were just a small family with a huge Maori community around them. They learned the ways of respect of the language. That's why I think Te Rongopai, the gospel, and why these horticultural, agricultural projects thrived in that early period. But it was when the odds turned in increased numbers, Governor Grey in his second term broke the treaty, and the quest for land south of Auckland, not only for fruit and veg, but for all kinds of other reasons, became a moral imperative that people were backing. They thought it was right, a great chain of being that the white man deserved to be able to cultivate, that whole way of thinking. Sadly, high ground of the treaty, the mana of Ngā Rangatira of those early years was seriously ignored and often betrayed. Because we got to know Tom and Bill in this Rangiaowhia sense, in those early days of the timeline, as you say, it was certainly greatly facilitated by Pa Cruz Pomare Fox, who was an early Māori missioner there. And we wanted to address the historical wrong because our bishop, Bishop Selwyn, who was bishop at the time, had been asked, as far as we can tell, by Rewi Manga Maniapoto to negotiate peaceful, safe sanctuary for the people of Ngāti Apakura, Ngāti Hinetū at Rangiaowhia during the land war. And as far as we can tell, one of the versions of the story, we're always open, of course, to improved or corrected versions, and that can well happen and should if it needs to. But our understanding was that the bishop was asked by Rewi to get a guarantee from General Cameron as he came down with his troops, as he started to prepare to attack Pātarangi, where they were expecting to defend themselves as an iwi, where they were saying, come no further, and they had 3 huge pā, which were virtually impregnable. He knew he could stop Cameron. He knew that that would be a line in the sand, and he was even saying, why don't you stay over near Rangiaowhia? You do your thing, we'll do our thing. But Cameron kept on coming because he wanted to take the lot. They had premeditated the attack on Rangiaowhia to wipe out the food supply. And so when Bishop Selwyn, as far as we know, went to General Cameron saying, during this battle at Pātarangi, will Rangiaowhia be safe? Can women, children, elderly people be safe for sanctuary in a peaceful agricultural, horticultural mission village? It had Catholic mission, it had Anglican mission. There were Pākehā living there, the Power family, for example. As far as we know, Bishop Selwyn got the impression from Cameron that they would be safe, and he came back and communicated that message. After that, when General Cameron saw the strength of the pā at Pātarangi, he changed his strategy, broke his promise, went round the back of the great pā of Pātarangi at night, crossed the 16K to Rangiaowhia peaceful village and attacked it in the early morning, which was undefended, which had been guaranteed refuge, sanctuary, safety by the bishop. And so our huge whakamā, our embarrassment as a church, was that our bishop had given a message of safety which was totally overturned. And that meant the false peace that he had explained, he'd negotiated, had been totally broken by General Cameron. And that led him to be seen very much as a hopelessly compromised failure at protection. Our view as a church is that he was trying to offer hospital support, a MASH type hospital, for both sides at Te Aumutu. He was like a mini Red Cross, if you will. He brought the hospital gear down with him behind the troops. He wanted to offer triage to Ngā Tamatoa and the British settler soldiers in the same place in Te Aumutu. He was not, as far as we know, initiating or participating in the attack. but he was clearly implicated in a false sense of security. For that reason, as well as a natural sense of injustice, we believed as a church we were morally implicated to whakateka te he nunui o ngā rao mua, to act restoratively for the great tragedy, mistake, disaster of the past, because our bishop was in the middle of it, and because it was also a breach of a treaty principle, which is central to our own constitution today. It was just absolutely awful, and we don't want to exonerate the bishop from getting totally caught up in a hopeless strategy and maneuver. We think he, within his frame, was trying to do what he could, but with the benefit of hindsight, I think any bishop would have acted very differently. He was pro-treaty, but he also thought the Queen's sovereignty ought to have some kind of overarching influence over land deals and settlements and military maneuvers. So he, in the light we have today, that made him extremely ambiguous. And that's the view of Tainui today, I believe, in one of their books called Tainui and the Treaty. They see him as initially an ally and friend, and then they see him as an ambiguous figure. And we wanted to say clearly, with our involvement in Rangiaowhia, no more ambiguity. We are choosing the side that ought to have been taken from the beginning in terms of natural justice, and we are being utterly and totally clear with time, talents, treasures, if you will, to join the iwi in recovery. The most powerful aspect we haven't mentioned so far, but we probably need to mention clearly, is that in the early morning attack on February 21, 1864, to an undefended small town, large village with 3 or 4 churches, all the facilities of a thriving commercial Maori entity with some Pākehā living there, certainly Catholic and Anglican missions booming. The attack resulted in people who had sheltered in a row-poor chapel based on the guarantees of safety, but also in fright and shock, gathered in those walls. As a consequence of the attack, the chapel, being made of row-poor, caught alight. The children and elderly people inside, of course, started to be extremely distressed. And one old man, Mankoroa, came out with a white flag to parley for truce and exit before the whare burned, and he was shot. Now that is a war crime. There's no getting around that. You have to say this war crime then resulted in pāhuatanga, form of murder and dispossession of innocent, non-combatant people, where you're facing the worst of all forms of disaster, tragedy, atrocity. And that requires maximum redemptive, coordinated effort. You don't just say, that's terrible, or, oh, let's do something that might band-aid this, or let's kind of move on because we're all in another century. It's not ever good enough to do that in the face of that sort of pāhuatanga. And that's the word that's used at Rangiaowhia of what happened. That's why it's such a comprehensive, in-depth, long-term, huge journey to rework the consequences. That's the heart of the matter, really. And little children who were named after aspects of the attack afterwards stays deep in the consciousness of the iwi. But they are an amazingly courageous, resourceful, and I say gentle people. They were then, and they are now. You go to Rangiaowhia to church or to a hui, and there's an amazing sense of depth and rangi Māori, which is not weakness. It's not kowtow, it's not being a doormat. It's having the centre of gravity in terms of ihi, wehi, mana, moi moia, whakahira tanga, looking uplift to a new future, slowly, painfully, but surely. That's why it's an extraordinary privilege for the church to shoulder that cross with them. Certainly I'm repeating the view, a firmly held view, of ngā kaumātua me ngā kuia o Ngāti Apakura Ngāti Hinetū. So I'm not reading off a Pākehā script or a history book. I'm repeating the mamai, but also the tūmanako of Ngāti Apakura as I've heard it, because the church was there.